Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of history's absolute biggest geopolitical chess matches, the high-stakes collision over the South African goldfields. When wealth on this massive of a scale is discovered, it's like throwing a match into a powder keg. It instantly sparks this incredibly complex power struggle involving huge personalities, media manipulation, and massive infrastructure projects. So let's jump right in and look at exactly how these factions maneuvered when literally everything was on the line.
Because, as you'll see, controlling these goldfields wasn't just about handing over some land deeds. No way. It was a vicious fight for political dominance, economic survival, and for some, total cultural preservation. We're going to examine the actual architecture of this tension. We'll look closely at who the key players were, what drove them, and the very specific, calculated strategies they used to try and outmaneuver one another in this totally high-stakes environment.
Part 1. Struggle for the goldfields.
Part 2. The imperialist power players.
Okay, so let's look at who is actually pulling the strings here. Power on the British side was heavily concentrated among three really dedicated imperialists. At the very top, you have Joseph Chamberlain, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies, pulling the big geopolitical levers. He strategically appointed Lord Milner as governor of the Cape. And rounding out this trio was Cecil Rhodes, the Prime Minister of the Cape. Together, they shared this unified ideology of expansion. Think about it. From the highest levels of the British government in London all the way down to local colonial administration, they were perfectly positioned and totally locked in.
And Rhodes? Well, he wasn't just a politician sitting behind a desk rubber stamping things. He was out there actively expanding British territory. He pushed boundaries, literally. By conquering this massive swath of land across the Limpopo River, he really demonstrated the sheer scale of his imperial ambitions. He even named this huge new territory after himself, Rhodesia. We know today as Zimbabwe. But this perfectly illustrates the mindset of the British imperialist faction. They were driven by this insatiable desire for conquest, constantly looking outward, eager to absorb new territories and resources. For men like Rhodes, the goldfields were just another piece, a very lucrative piece, sure, but just another piece of a much larger continental puzzle that they fully intended to control.
Part 3. The Boer resistance.
Now, flip the board and look at the other side of this escalating conflict. You have the Afrikaners, also known as the Boers. Now, their society was deeply religious and highly conservative. They valued a quiet, very traditional way of life, which was suddenly being completely upended by the discovery of gold. Because with the gold rush came a massive influx of what they called outlanders, which translates to outsiders. And the Boers were deeply, deeply resentful of these outlanders. They didn't just see them as economic competitors coming for the gold, they perceived them as a direct demographic and cultural threat. The sudden arrival of thousands of foreigners with totally different values and allegiances, to the Boers, that was a dangerous force that could completely destabilize their traditional society.
And right here, this is the absolute root of the tension. You have an aggressively expanding imperial power seeking territorial conquest on one side, and on the other, a defensive, conservative people who basically just want to maintain their quiet, traditional way of life, completely free from outside interference. It was this fundamental clash of worldviews, and the goldfields just happened to be the geographic flashpoint where these two totally incompatible ways of life collided.
Part 4. Propaganda and infrastructure.
So, how do you actually fight a war before the bullets start flying? Well, Rhodes weaponized the media. He was smart enough to not just rely on his political title. He fundamentally understood the power of the narrative. By personally owning two major regional publications, the Johannesburg Star and the Cape Times, Rhodes gave himself this massive built-in megaphone. It allowed him to project his imperialist views directly to the public. And honestly, this is a vital tactic in any conflict, right? If you can control the flow of information, you can control exactly how the public perceives the situation.
And he didn't just passively own these papers, he absolutely put them to work. These publications actively pushed a narrative that systematically stirred up British public opinion. Their clear, defined goal was to build favor for a war with the Tsar, the South African Republic, which is where the Boers held power. Actually, think about the modern implications of that for a second. Rhodes used his private ownership of the press to basically manufacture consent for a massive political and military conflict. By agitating the public and painting the Boers as the ultimate enemy, the imperialists were laying down the psychological groundwork they needed to justify taking control of those goldfields by force.
But meanwhile, the Boers weren't just sitting back taking this. President Kruger, the leader of the Tsar, recognized the immense danger of being economically suffocated by the British. See, at the time, the primary railway lines ran from the Cape and Natal,
and those were territories firmly controlled by the British. If Kruger relied on those lines, the British could literally cut off the Boers' economic lifeline at any given moment. So, what does Kruger do? He counters this imperial pressure with a massive logistical flex of his own. He builds independent infrastructure. By constructing his own railway line straight to Delagoa Bay, Kruger brilliantly ensured the Boers would not have to rely on British-controlled railways. He essentially bypassed the entire British monopoly. It secured an independent route for trade and supplies, proving that the Boers were willing to take massive, proactive steps to protect their sovereignty.
So as we wrap up this explainer on these historical tensions, it's wild to see how a clash over resources so quickly escalated into this masterclass in strategic warfare. On one hand, you have Cecil Rhodes utilizing the press to stir up war and totally manipulate public opinion. And on the other hand, you've got President Kruger building massive railway infrastructure to secure total economic independence and completely bypass his enemies. They are both incredibly powerful tactics. So I want to leave you with this final thought to consider about the timeless mechanics of conflict. When two wildly different factions are fighting for the ultimate prize, which strategy truly gives you the upper hand? Is it the ability to control the narrative or the ability to control your own economic destiny?